An XRP community member had a question for David Schwartz, who of course is co-creator of XRP and the XRP ledger, and he was asked about the odds of XRP ever hitting $100, and it ended up evolving into a conversation, broadly speaking, about the topic of whether or not XRP is potentially mispriced, or whether any asset in general can be mispriced. To what degree is pricing rational in a general sense? There was an acknowledgement from David Schwartz that at least for some periods of time you can have pricing that is, well, if it's not rational, it's probably irrational. And so in that sense, I guess you could say that the price just doesn't make sense. And I think that there are a lot of us in the XRP community who have thought, yeah, the price of XRP is a lot lower than what it probably should be right now if the rest of the world knew what we knew. But they don't. And of course, there's more to say than just that, but anytime I've ever said anything along the lines of, yeah, the price of XRP is a lot lower than it should be, really the idea that I'm trying to convey is that we are early and most people just haven't even ever heard of it. And so as a result, haven't even thought about the concept of researching it because they don't know it exists. They would have to know it exists first. Most people are not in crypto. And so the odds of somebody finding out about crypto, finding out about XRP, then genuinely looking into it for more than 5 seconds to go through the in-depth process of research to genuinely understand it, that's just not something most people are going to do. It's going to take time, but it's happened for me. And if you're listening to this, I'm willing to bet it happened for you. And so it can't. So that's more so what I mean. But if you're talking about based on the participants in the crypto space right now, should it be priced any different? Well, that's a very different question. But I do think, the price that XRP is right now, if you fast forward, a decade into the future, this is going to look dirt cheap, and we'll start to think, the further out time goes, yeah, it's getting at least closer to where it probably should be. But before going further, I do want to be clear, I do not have a financial background of any kind. I am not offering financial advice, and you definitely should not buy or sell anything because of anything I say or write. I'm just an enthusiast who enjoys making YouTube videos about crypto-related topics, but just as a hobby and just for fun. All right, so the Crypto Basic noticed this, the conversation on X. They wrote an article about it titled, David Schwartz admits XRP price may not always reflect rational market expectations. And so I'm going to go straight to the source because I do want to provide full context for what David Schwartz was arguing here. And I think there are a lot of good points that are made by David Schwartz. There are also a lot of good points made by an XRP community member who goes by the name Mr. Nobody. Not somebody I'm familiar with, but I read that post and I was like, yeah, that's a lot of good stuff. In fact, some of the stuff that he brought up, it's stuff that I've talked about over the years. And some developments were more recent than this. But here you can see XRP community member Wolf King wrote to David Schwartz and said, as the creator and overlord of XRP, what are the chances of XRP reaching $100? Oh, the overlord. That's a little bit dramatic. But David Schwartz actually did respond. And so he wrote here, call me crazy, but I still think crypto prices are mostly rational over the long term. That means nobody can reasonably expect any cryptocurrency to, say, have a 70% chance of doubling in the next year, because if they did, the price would have already risen based on that expectation. I recognize that I am very much in the minority in this view. If people really thought that Bitcoin had a 50% chance of being $500,000 in the next 2 years, billionaires would buy up Bitcoin until the price was over $100,000 now. So I got to pause to say here, and I think a little bit differently than him on that, because there are a couple considerations, actually. It's not just what you think is going to happen, it's how risky is it to act on what you think is probable to occur. For example, and I remember saying this at the time, so I've been in the XRP community since late 2017. I launched my YouTube channel in late 2018, and I remember the early days, and I would have been saying this a handful of times throughout 2019, I'm sure. I said, look, I believe that the crypto asset class is going to substantially outperform the stock market over the next decade. And I've been, with each passing year, I've continued to say that because with each passing year, I still believe it's true. And I also believed back then that if I were to put my entire net worth into XRP, I believed that what's probable is that a decade out, it would have substantially outperformed my investment if I just had it in the stock market, just say like, an ETF that tracks the S&P 500, something like that. My belief was that XRP would likely substantially outperform. And I've certainly been right about that. XRP has ridiculously, laughably outperformed the stock market. But did I put all of my net worth into XRP just because I thought that would be the likely occurrence? Well, no, because there's this other side of the equation that says, okay, you may think that's the most probable thing very genuinely, but if you're wrong, if you put it all in XRP, you lose everything. So it's not just that. Even if you think so-and-so is likely, all I'm pointing out is that you have to factor in risk. And for some, if the risk is too high, maybe you're not going to do it. Maybe you're not going to put in anything at all, just because. And maybe maybe you would put in a little bit if you're a filthy rich individual. All I'm saying is that when it comes to investing, a lot of people look at things a lot of different ways, and you can't know exactly the reasons that everybody's doing what they're doing, of course. So I was just pointing out that that's another thing to consider. And so then he said, because billionaires are genuinely able to deploy at least some capital in a smart way and rational way, and not do very much of that would be needed. And he said, not very much of that would be needed to push the price up to $100,000. It's almost certainly not possible to rationally believe that Bitcoin will do that. Same for every other liquid asset that's easily tradable. So it depends, though. And we're going to circle back to this concept a little bit later because he has a lot more to say, actually. But I think it's definitely the case that you can have instances where a market is not rational. You can get way overbought and get into market euphoria, and way oversold and get into market panic. And so there are extremes where I would say, okay, there's a lot of people that really are not using their noggins when it comes to investing. So that's a possibility. But yeah, I think if you're talking over the long haul, I think that the market, it's a messy process, but on the whole, it's going to end up reflecting something that is more or less a rational process. It's just when, it's the beginnings of an asset class. Again, crypto didn't exist a little over 17 years ago. Yeah, it turns out that it takes a long time for this stuff to really take hold. And here's some reasons why. So there's this post from XRP community member Mr. Nobody, and I thought this is a pretty darn good post. And he said here the following, and he's bringing up in this post a lot of stuff that I brought up. So Mr. Nobody wrote, David, I get your point about markets pricing expectations in advance, but I'm struggling to reconcile that with what we're actually seeing around XRP. And so check this out. These are great points. He says, if markets were perfectly pricing probabilities, how do we explain the persistent decline of XRP balances on exchanges, suggesting accumulation and self-custody, the steady inflows and accumulation from ETFs and institutional vehicles, and reports of large entities accumulating over time, all while the spot price remains relatively suppressed? Okay, great points. And this is stuff I have brought up a number of times recently. It is true that you are seeing XRP flow off of exchanges, which typically means there's no intent to sell it anytime soon. It is also true that there have been ridiculously high inflows for over 4 months now, on the whole, into spot XRP ETFs, which are backed by actual XRP. All of that materially matters. So then you can look at that and say, well, then what the hell's going on with the price? Now, my personal thought is that in general, of course, the market moves in tandem on top of it, but it's not always going to be the case that everybody is responding rational. So what I'm saying is this could be one of those moments, and I think is, where a market has gotten oversold. I mean, look what happened ever since the liquidation event on October 10th, that Black Swan event. The market has fallen, XRP down over 50%, Bitcoin down over 50%, at its worst anyway, February 5th. So that happened. And that it's just going to spook people. Like, people are going to emotionally respond. But we've seen this. History has been replete with these instances, again, for over 17 years now, including XRP. And eventually, you stop for a lot longer periods of time. So you end up getting out of these extremes. Because most of the time, we're not in extreme greed or extreme fear. We're somewhere in between. You could still be in greed. You could still be in fear. But to be at the true extremes of those, that takes up a much lower percentage of the time. So my argument would be, yeah, we're at one of the extremes right now. And so it does seem lopsided, and it does seem like an opportunity for those who want to accumulate more XRP. So when he brings these points up, it's like, hell yeah, there's actual data. That's not just Mr. Nobody's opinion here. He's saying truth. That these are facts. And to me, that indicates that the smart money absolutely has been accumulating. And so those people, I think, are acting rationally. And it depends on what you mean. What is it to act rationally? Are the people who feel emotions in selling, are they acting irrationally? Well, I would say probably, yeah. If you're making important financial decisions based on your feels, yeah, you're probably being a bit irrational. Use logic and data and reason. And I'll tell you this, the people, whether they're right or wrong to do so, the people who are buying when the market's down dramatically, they're probably using data rather than emotions to come to the conclusion that they should take that action. I would hazard that guess. Anyway, Mr. Nobody continues. He says, to me, that suggests one of a few possibilities. Number one, the market is still structurally inefficient in crypto, liquidity fragmentation, derivatives dominance, etc. So price discovery doesn't fully reflect long-term expectations yet. And folks, that's certainly true. I mean, in terms of liquidity, fine, the markets are a lot more liquid than they were a decade ago. But compared to any other asset class on the frickin' planet, no, certainly not. But that's also why there's opportunity. There's so little money in XRP, for example, that it doesn't take a lot of money flowing in to get crazy multiplier effects. Let's be real. That's why you and I are here. It's for the opportunity of life-changing wealth. And so, but again, you can see more ridiculous looking extremes to the positive and the negative as years pass at various points because of that. So that's true. Number two, he says, a large portion of accumulation is happening off exchange or through vehicles that don't immediately impact spot price. Now, folks, that's another one I've talked about so many times over the years. There are so many transactions that are done OTC, over the counter, and it is by the rich people. It's by the institutions and rich individuals. And what they're doing is they're purchasing from large institutions, large organizations, exchanges, even like it could be Coinbase, for example. So if you're a rich individual, just as a hypothetical, and you want to buy a boatload of XRP or Bitcoin or whatever it is, but you don't want to move the market, what you will do, because you know that Coinbase has a huge stockpile, not just of their customers' holdings, but also their own holdings, which they own, and you can purchase it from them. And it's not listed for sale on exchange. So when it happens, you don't even see it. It just happens behind the scene. Just like, for example, I could sell my XRP if I wanted to on an exchange right now. I have the ability to do that, and everybody could see that I have it for sale. And that type of data is tracked. On the flip side, in real life, for example, I could communicate with words face to face with a human if I wanted. I will sell my XRP to you at so and so price, and then just without an exchange, move it to the ledger, and maybe they give me paper money. So now, of course, I know that's not happening a lot, but you get the idea, right? The point is there can be and are transactions that are happening in any number of ways that don't show up on exchanges, and so that does impact in real time, it does impact the supply and demand dynamics, but the market's not going to respond immediately, because since that person in this hypothetical bought my XRP from me off of an exchange, and you can't even see that it happened, but it did happen. That means that they don't have to buy it from somebody else. And so obviously the implications, they're going to ripple throughout the entire ecosystem, even though that would just be on a smaller scale, but you get what I'm saying here. And so it is true that all these institutions that are purchasing OTC, you're not going to see that right away. Now, eventually, since Coinbase will continue to sell over the counter, for example, they're going to need to replenish their holdings, which means they then have to purchase it from someone. And so those ramifications will ripple throughout the entire global ecosystem. That is true. What I'm saying here is it doesn't happen instantly. That's what Mr. Nobody's getting at. That is a smart thing to acknowledge. That is actually true. So that is another piece of the puzzle. It actually is. Number three, Mr. Nobody says institutions may believe the upside exists, but are still early in their allocation phase, so the price hasn't fully adjusted yet. And that's another thing. These institutions don't necessarily purchase all of the asset that they're purchasing. It could be, XRP or otherwise. They don't necessarily purchase all they're willing to in one go. A lot of people, businesses, and institutions, they really do dollar cost average in over some period of time. And so if they're the ones that are the rational actors, and then even if just in the short term, there are a lot of people who are afraid, so they're not acting rationally, that can result in an imbalance also. And then he says, so in other words, isn't it possible that the market is gradually positioning for a repricing, but the process is slower and less visible than traditional efficient market theory would suggest? Genuinely curious how you reconcile the efficient pricing argument with the observable supply dynamics around XRP. That's a very thoughtful post, because you're looking at all this stuff that should ultimately drive the price of XRP, but the price isn't driving right now. Exactly. They are positioning early, though, so I would expect that. So David Schwartz, he actually did ultimately respond to this, and Mr. Nobody reposted. He didn't initially get a response, but he wrote, "I'm still waiting for a response, Mr. David Schwartz." And then somebody named Viva XRP, who seems to be a real jerk. I don't know who this guy is, but apparently I had already blocked him, which means that he's kind of like a stick in the mud consistently. He sure as hell was rude here. He wrote, "This bastard of David Schwartz never answer, only tweet shit to take our money, ... So obviously that guy's a real piece of work. Going to go ahead and keep him blocked. But David Schwartz responded to that guy, of all people, which is interesting. And he was quite civil here. David said, "I didn't respond to that post because I couldn't think of anything useful or responsive to say to it. I think the prices are rational largely because there are enough rational wealthy people, and the markets for all major cryptocurrencies are open enough and functional enough over medium to long terms. If you think you can rationally conclude that the price is irrational, and so there must be some kind of manipulation or deception going on, then others could conclude that too, and would buy or sell despite that deception and cause the price to, again, be rational." Yeah, so I guess the argument against that, and I'm not saying he's wrong, but I think the argument against that would be, but the deception or whatever, manipulation, whatever it may be, would be at such a great scale. Now, I'm not saying I believe that, but that's probably the best argument you can come up with against that. But that's why, at least my train of thought is this, is you're going to, just sum it up, at the extremes, you're going to see irrational behavior. And in between that, it's probably going to be more or less rational. That is true, because outside of the extremes, it's just regular people like you and me who are aware of this, and we can't force the rest of the world to be here. That just kind of trickles in as time passes, and then there'll be moments in time where you get boatloads of new people all at once when you get those euphoric moments, and a certain number of them stick around even when we get into the bear market. That's what happened with me when I jumped in 2017 going into 2018. I was there when the rest of the tourists were coming by, and I easily could have been a tourist, but it did grab me, and I did stick around even throughout the bear market, and here I am all these years later. So all that to say, there are always going to be a certain amount of people that really do get grabbed by crypto, and if you're listening to this right now, I'm willing to bet that you're one of them, because most people aren't paying attention right now, but it is an important time to pay attention to crypto. Anyway, and then David said, to put it simply, to say, I can rationally conclude from evidence that the current long-term price movements are irrational is almost self-contradictory, because if you could, others could too, and they would force the price movements to better align with long-term outcomes. Well, I mean, if David's right and most people could use logic properly to figure that out, then he's got a good argument, certainly. Then David said, now, if you want to say that deception and manipulation is suppressing the price of some asset and will likely do so for some indefinitely long period in the future, then you can say that. That might even be true. And so, folks, that's the part where you could say, okay, does that mean that really we could be right when we think XRP price doesn't make sense? Because he is saying here, for some period of time, more or less, that could happen. Those are his. I paraphrased. His words are on the screen right there. I just read them. And then he says, but that means the current price is rational, and who knows how long you need to hold the asset before that suppression ends and the price goes up, if it ever does. There's an old saying that the market can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent. Let's say you think there's some factor, let's call that factor X, that should raise the price of an asset in the future. And let's say there's some factor Y that you think is holding the price of the asset down. The bull case for the asset has to be that Y will lessen or go away while X remains strong. And in a liquid market, it has to be that you can see this opportunity while others haven't, because if others have, they would have already priced the opportunity you see it. Okay, so I will pause right there to state, I actually do generally think that. I think that some people are going to look at the same set of facts, and for some people, something's going to click, and they'll be right, and for others, they're just not going to get it. And in the case of XRP, to me, it's my opinion, if I'm wrong, then I'm wrong, but I believe XRP is an obvious early winner in the crypto space. And I do think more and more people get that as time passes. But most people just aren't visionary enough. So when it comes to even considering a new asset class like crypto, it takes a long time to get people there, actually. Anyway, then David says, I know it sounds crazy, but among assets competing in an open and liquid market, there is an important sense in which all investments are equally good. If there was one that was objectively and demonstrably better than another, rational people would sell or short the worse asset to buy or otherwise get long exposure